Thank you so much for joining us on It's Time today. We are your hosts. I'm Lindsley Donnelly, your citizen scientist and your longevity expert for midlife women.
And I'm Dr. Jen Wagner, physician and holistic performance expert. Welcome to It's Time, powered by Prosper. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to It's Time. I'm so glad to have Lynn's back after having to do a little solo science update last week, which was also fun. Lynn's is going to sprinkle in some solo knowledge from time to time as well. But we are so glad to be back together and back with you. And we're just kind of continuing on this category of how we use our thoughts and emotions and the science behind that and how it then translates into our lives, our physical health, our mental health, our economic health, our social health, all of these things.
Yes. And I think, we started this whole idea of our 5 pillars, and we always start with mindset. And, sometimes we just gloss over why. And so the more we learn about mindset, the more compelling and exciting it is that it is the most powerful lever you can pull if you want to have an outcome different than what you're experiencing right now, or you have something you want to put in place in 5 or 10 years, or you're working with someone like you're parenting or you're coaching. Going after that mindset lever first is where you get kind of big bang for the buck. So we're coming back into that a little bit today, talking expectation theory.
And I think this is so interesting. There is a tendency to kind of revert to being a passive participant in this part of our lives, that things are just going to happen to me. I don't have any control. I can only, respond, instead of being very proactive in the fact that we actually do. And when we look at people who we deem successful, and by successful, I'm not just meaning monetarily successful, like living these full, happy lives.
Yes.
They have often taken a very active role in these areas. And they are not sitting back waiting for life to happen to them. They are going out and working towards the life they want very intentionally.
Yes. And, I think for so many years, we would maybe be observing others, and a lot of people do just naturally have the skill set. But the opportunity on imitation right now is it is a skill set. It is a muscle training opportunity. And so when you're in a moment where you want to change the way you're feeling about something or change actually what happens, these are practices and specific kind of muscle building things that you can put into place, especially, again, when you're trying to work with others and help them change outcomes as well. Right. To be able to ground it.
So we are going to dive into expectation theory. And this might have a lot of parallels or similarities to manifestation that we talked about just recently. But I think, for some people, manifestation might be a little bit harder to grasp. It might seem a little more foreign. But I would wager a bet that almost everyone has expectations, good expectations and bad expectations. Like we are going to do something. We have an expectation of how it's going to turn out.
Right.
And so I think what we really want to talk about today is the science behind that and what is happening in our brains when we have these expectations and how we can harness that power to more likely lead to the expectation that we would like.
Right. Because, we sort of glossed over this when we talked about manifestation. There were a series of different scientific pillars underneath manifestation, one of which is the expectation theory. And that whole body of research around how expectations drive outcomes, the science underneath that is what we're going to get into today. Because it's, when you're talking with yourself or you're talking with others, to be able to kind of break down, how does this actually work? How does expectation theory work? And so probably from a definition perspective, what we're talking about is expectations. They are not actually just something kind of abstract that go in and out of your head. They are active thought patterns that your brain organizes around to support, right? So it's not like something in the cloud that you're just like, oh, I'm expecting that. No, you're actually wiring your brain a certain way. And then your brain gets organized to line up with what you told it to wire.
Correct. And I think that, if we think about this, it makes sense, right? It makes sense even from our brains don't like chaos, right? They like planning and they like organization. And, we can look back to the cave people times, when you walked into the jungle or you walked into the brush, there was an expectation that maybe I'm going to find food, or maybe something bad, there's a danger here. And so that brain communication, and we're going to get into this more, between different, very specific brain regions helps to form those expectations between our kind of controlled thoughts in our prefrontal cortex going back and forth into our amygdala, which is, kind of our primitive brain, like danger, safety,
Yeah.
to try to guide these.
Yeah. So I love the way you break down the brain and how it kind of powers up everything. So if we start with that, because you touched on it right there, it's like, okay, expectations originate in the prefrontal cortex. And then what does that mean? Why does that even important?
So, our prefrontal cortex is kind of our, for lack of a better word, kind of our gatekeeper, right? It is the control center, and it takes a while to develop, which is why sometimes when you watch a toddler do something, they don't have the same expectations, right? They don't have that same level of control that we develop over time and as we age and mature. But that prefrontal cortex, then as we form these expectations, it starts to send very deliberate messages to other parts of our brain, right? Specifically our amygdala, like, this is my expectation. Does this put me in a safe or unsafe zone? And then that tends to influence the neurochemistry that's released with those expectations.
Yes. Yeah. So that top down processing, kind of understanding that there is an organized system in what your brain is doing is kind of, I find that really freeing then to go, hey, I'm going to go tell that top down system means something different. And
Yeah.
you're doing that with the prefrontal cortex. One of the, because we always talk about the science generically, but I think one of the things that was helpful to me digesting all of this was the three different kind of major bodies of research.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the placebo effect is one that we've all heard about. Maybe we can do a quick summary of that as my doctor medical expert, the placebo effect.
Yeah. So the placebo effect, and I know we're going to balance this out in just a second, is so in medicine, we use it all the time. It's how we test medications, right? It's how we study different medications. But if you think something is going to happen, if say you have a headache and you think that taking a pain reliever is going to relieve that headache, it is much more likely to relieve that headache because that is your expected outcome. So your prefrontal cortex has said, this is what's going to happen. And it is telling your body, the rest of your body that, the rest of your brain and the rest of your body that. And so it is more likely to happen. And so we have to manage that when we design scientific research, like what is real and what is placebo effect. Now, the placebo effect is real. It's just not from the intervention that we thought.
Not causal.
Right? So,
how is this? It's not causal, right?
Right. So exactly. And so we have to balance that. But the placebo effect can be used in a really powerful way, right? That if we think this is what's going to happen and we start to imprint those brain signals, it is very real. And so that is how we use some of these alternative therapies. It's how we've discovered some things, and it's how we've actually really learned the power of the brain to influence how we feel is through this placebo effect. And so, it does go with, I expect this to work.
Yes.
And then it is balanced a little bit with the reality of what is the situation happening and is it working? And sometimes, even if it doesn't work in the way we thought it would, we still walk away with a positive feeling from that event, encounter, whatever the situation is, because we thought it was going to work.
Yes. Yeah. I think that's kind of brings us to the second body of research, which is the reverse of that, right? That I really had never heard about this until we started diving in. It's called the nocebo effect, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in the medical context, the same exact thinking flipped on its head, like we're going to give painkillers to a patient, but we're going to tell them that we haven't, and that there is no relief for the pain. The studies found that the patient, terrible to be on this experiment, felt the same pain as somebody who didn't have a painkiller. Like they just expected to feel pain, so their body generated a pain response. So the kind of the corollary to this is if you're walking around expecting bad, you're likely going to pattern behaviors that have that outcome.
All the time in my anesthesia world, right? That patients, rightfully so, are really, really worried about having pain after having surgery. Totally reasonable thing. And we often see this when we are doing nerve blocks, right? That we are going to numb a major nerve, and people would not have any feeling and not be able to move a limb because we've numbed those nerves. But say they had pain, like we can do these nerve blocks, which really take away 100% of people's postoperative pain. But there's a cognitive component that they have to believe that is going to work. And so it is having a really long conversation before we do it about expectations, that yes, you are expecting to have pain. We are going to take care of that. it is going to feel different. You're going to feel numb. And some people find that as uncomfortable. So redefining things. But I found when I didn't do that, they woke up and thought they were in pain.
Yeah.
When we kind of helped them set realistic expectations that it's not going to be pain, but it's going to feel different. And sometimes that different might be uncomfortable at first, but it's not pain the way you're expecting pain. They had a much better outcome. And
Yeah.
so it's really interesting that, how you can kind of take what they're expecting in that nocebo environment and help to shift it just by talking about exactly what their expectations are and finding ways to help either kind of modify those expectations a little bit or explain those expectations a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that's a fascinating one to kind of keep in the back of the mind is actively intercepting negative expectations can be as powerful as rebuilding positive ones. It's a full effect. And I think the third body of research that's sort of an underpinning of expectation theory is something called the Rosenthal effect, which was, I think this study has been pretty well communicated, but it's worth reminding people. It's the study with elementary age children, and it was a broad body of research where the researchers split children into two different groups and sort of told children that they were smart and then told children that they were not, or they were capable or they were not. And then they did a different permutation of that where they didn't really tell the children anything, but they told teachers, these are the smart children and these are the challenged children. And the way the body of research went through this experiment was to then measure outcomes longitudinally over time, which is also another horrible thing to think about. Hopefully they rewired everybody the other way. But people who thought they were smart performed better, than people who thought they were not. And more importantly, to some people in this context as a midlife woman, as well as people who were told a body of students were smart, those children performed better because of the way the teachers interacted with those children. So that is such a powerful opportunity in your own control with how you engage with your own children, or you engage with your teams, or you engage obviously with yourself, is to tell yourself what you want those communities to be like and what you think those communities can be like, and they will more often than not rise to those expectations.
Right. Absolutely. And I think, we do this often with others, right? Especially if you're a parent, we do this often. And I think it is part of that maturation and growth process. Like there are, all the time I hear from my own kids, I'm just not good at that. I'm like, why would you say that? Or I'm not smart enough to do that. Or, like I have kids that are looking at colleges right now. I'm not smart enough to go there. I'm like, why are you setting that expectation?
Right.
Like what is triggering you to feel that way? And so it is interesting that I think, again, this is one of those things that we probably, without even realizing it, coach others through all the time, but we don't do a very good job of coaching ourselves through this.
Right.
We don't follow our own advice very often.
That's kind of 100% of the time. But that expectation of, is it more painful to have high expectations and not meet them? Or is it more painful just to have low expectations and not be disappointed? And so that's the conversation underneath that, as well as the outcome is going to be the same, right? So just why not expect more and don't give credence to the pain of the gap if there is a gap.
Yeah. And, I don't want to go too much far down the rabbit hole here, but I think that, it ties back into our fear of failure, right? And this idea that if something doesn't go the way you have expected it to go, that you've failed. And those are not mutually exclusive events. Like there are so many factors between the expectation and actual failure, which is, I think, pretty rare. I think it's pretty rare to leave a situation where there was not some sort of learning or some sort of positive thing that you can look for. But again, I think we've tied those two things in society so close to each other that, to your point, many people have chosen to have much lower expectations to avoid this fear of failure.
I think that kind of feeds into that second component of the expectation theory, which is the motivational expectation theory, right?
Exactly. You read my mind. That's exactly what I was going to say. So yes. Walk us through this, because I think this is fascinating. And it's always our goal that we leave our community with some tangible takeaways. And I think this is one in a kind of a setting where there's not a lot of like, oh, I can go pick up something heavy and that's very tangible. But I think this is having this formula is helpful in framing these ideas.
Yeah. So, we always hear the word like you just need motivation, like just get motivated. And you're like, what does that mean? What even is motivation? And so this body of research kind of breaks the idea of motivation down into three more tangible components. So the first one is called expectancy. And it's this idea that there is effort, and effort leads to a performance. So this is the expectancy component of what we're talking about in the expectancy theories. I do this and I expect an outcome, a performance. The second idea is called instrumentality. And that is the idea that the performance itself is meaningful, or it resonates because it leads to a reward, right? So we've talked about some of the neurochemistry around the reward systems and dopamine, and the idea that you do something and that drives an outcome or performance, and that performance leads to a reward is what is kind of propelling a lot of the behavior. And then the last component of it that has to be there, and it's kind of obvious, but it is explicit, is valence. So valence is the idea that reward has a value. So, in simple terms, it's like if it's worth $1 or is it worth $100 million? And so the degree of the reward is meaningful in the motivation equation as much as the idea that there is a reward. And so the way that breaks down from a formulaic perspective is the idea of trying to create motivation in ourselves, or again, in a coaching paradigm or a parenting paradigm, is to think of it like a formula. The idea that the expectancy times the instrumentality times the valence equals the degree of motivation. So if you're like struggling to get more motivated, those are the three areas that you can amp up. Like, okay, talk to myself a little bit about the expectancy of effort is going to connect to this performance. And so that's the inner dialogue. Or
Interesting. Yeah.
there is actually a reward for me going into this cold plunge because I'm going to create good neurochemistry. Just, telling yourself the story of what the reward is, and then also assigning a huge value to that reward. So what is the upside? And the upside could be time, could be energy, could be money, whatever is the component of value, but figuring out how to amplify it. And so the application of that is trying to think about the context of motivating others and motivating ourselves by explicitly addressing one of those three components of motivation.
I think that's fascinating. And it also gives some customization to this process, because maybe we're really good at one of those three. And because they're all interrelated, you can say, gosh, I'm good at doing the work, but I'm not so focused on the reward. So maybe I need to up level my reward or my idea of this reward because I maxed out in another category, or et cetera. So I think I like that it can break it down into three very important components, but also very specific components that then you can say, okay, you can kind of take a quick gauge of where am I across the spectrum for each of these items.
Yeah. And I think one of the things we don't give credence to as much is the idea of a reward can be really simple. Like for some people, it's literally crossing it off their to-do list. So if you're going to change, let's think about this in terms of our longevity work, right? Like if you're going to change your sleep patterns, you have to give yourself the value, the credit for that as a real to-do. So you write it down in your to-dos as I started to go to bed an hour early, and you check it off. So, but that'll do the brain expectation theory rewiring to give it value, to give it credence.
So cool. I mean, so many things here. And I think, the last of this that we've kind of touched on is just the brain hierarchy and how these neural signals are. So I don't want to totally rehash that because I think we've touched on that through this, but let's just summarize again that, expectation is what we expect shapes our perception, our behaviors, and the outcome.
Yes.
And we can see that, and it's tied to motivation. We tie it to motivation through this formula of what we expect, how we can instrument that expectation, and then the reward.
And the value of it.
If we take it out of our fancy science words.
Yeah, that's right. Yes. You give it credence with a positive reward and then amp up that reward. And, we talk about this in terms of mindset or longevity or parenting or things, but I think sometimes it brings a practical filter to it. And you're like, I'm still kind of feels fuzzy, this expectation theory, but you can look at it in the world of economics as well. Expectation theory is fundamental in how inflationary trends are accelerated or how markets are moving. The underpinning in all of that is what are humans' expectations for what the market is going to do. And so you'll see this in, obviously in our media right now, where people are talking about what is going to happen and then does it start to happen. So I think it's just a fun way to be looking at the world and filtering, like, where is expectation theory at play here?
Right. And I think, we can, even when we talk about our longevity, right? Like if we are doing these things and we expect to get stronger, we're
Yes.
going to keep doing them to get stronger. If we are just like what you said with sleep. And so I think we can apply this across the board. And again, I think one of your great examples is always going back to education as well. And whether this is education of a younger person or more education as in a mentoring model, with maybe some of our more professional colleagues, et cetera, is it's good to put expectations
Yes.
on people and let them rise to those challenges. And I know we're going to talk about this a little bit more down the line when we talk more about confidence, but I think the world went to from a very competitive place, and I'm thinking this through the lens of our kids,
Mm-hmm.
to everybody gets a cookie and everybody gets a medal, and we're happy that people are just showing up. And I think for a generation, we might have done them a little bit of a disservice without having some things that are a challenge, And so I think going back to say, I believe in you, and I think I expect you to be able to do this. And I think, whether it's in the workplace and you're leading a team, to say, I have expectations on you, I think it does so much to foster growth.
Yes.
And it's important that and it's like, and we're going to get into this too when we talk about confidence, but it's like we can help ourselves and our teams. There's different durations and intensities of expectation, right? And so we can practice this theory and this behavior by saying, okay, let's do something small where the reward is maybe shorter term or more immediately available, and then we gain confidence that, okay, I went through this process and I
Yes.
got my desired expectation.
Yeah.
So I'm going to now do something that's a little more challenging and start to stretch ourselves and grow in this capacity.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. So, I think kind of our summary takeaway, we hope, is that the idea of expectation theory really should be an empowering one.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully it's an invitation to rethink what you're out there. It's not voodoo, it's not woo woo, not channeling. It's like your brain organizes to support what you tell it to. So you can intercept negative expectations and then you can reframe them real time, as well as mindfully, intentionally set positive expectations and communicate those to the people you love in your communities, in your workplace.
Well, we hope you guys enjoyed this. I think it's really fascinating to actually look at some things that we do subconsciously a lot of the time and feel empowered by that we actually have more control over these than just being passive observers, which is sometimes just what happens because we don't take the time to really intentionally stop and reflect it at these points. So thanks, Linz, again for sharing all this, and we'll talk to you guys soon. Take care.
Thank you so much for spending your time with us here today. If you liked what you heard and you got some tips on how to live better right now and for the long haul, please help us reach more midlife women. Please share and rate and like this show, and we can't wait to continue the dialogue with you on our next episode. Until then, thank you. It's time.